There's been no summer slowdown in Washington, D.C. President Trump's takeover of the capital city's police is about to enter its third week. And now the president is threatening to send National Guard troops to other cities. It comes as the FBI searched the home of President Trump's former national security advisor, John Bolton. Joining us to discuss all this is NPR senior White House correspondent Tamara Keith. Good morning.
Good morning.
So let's start with John Bolton. How do you view this development?
Yeah, so he was a first-term national security advisor and has since become a vocal Trump critic, something that Trump complained about recently on social media. And one of Trump's first acts as president was to withdraw Secret Service protection from Bolton. That was protection he had because Iran wants him dead. So that's the context in which this search of Bolton's home took place. Two sources familiar with the investigation who weren't authorized to speak publicly told NPR that the search of Bolton's home and office was tied to his handling of classified documents. During an interview on Friday for NBC's Meet the Press, Vice President J.D. Vance was specifically asked if Bolton was being targeted because he's a critic of President Trump. And Vance insisted he wasn't.
If we bring a case, and of course we haven't done that yet, the Department of Justice has not done that yet. We are investigating Ambassador Bolton, but if they ultimately bring a case, it will be because they determine that he has broken the law.
And I will note, he says we. In any other administration, you wouldn't hear the White House talking about a potential Justice Department criminal case as we, because there's supposed to be a separation, but that just doesn't exist in the Trump administration. Vance brought up the Justice Department prosecutions of Trump and his allies during the Biden administration. The view in MAGA world is that opened Pandora's box, and now all bets are off.
Tam, if you would, can you just give us a little more context? Is this just about John Bolton?
Not even close. Senator Adam Schiff, who led Trump's first impeachment, is being investigated for alleged mortgage fraud. So is Letitia James, the prosecutor in New York, who secured a fraud conviction against Trump when he was out of office. Other outspoken critics of Trump are openly expressing concern that they could be next. During the campaign, President Trump told supporters, "I am your retribution." And many people sounded alarmed. So Trump said, no, don't worry. All he meant was that success would be retribution. It is now clear that, in fact, retribution is retribution.
I mean, here in D.C., you do see some National Guard troops patrolling the streets. But now President Trump is talking about sending troops to Chicago. That's drawn a strong response.
Yeah, on Friday in the Oval Office, President Trump suggested that Chicago and New York may be next. Those are both blue cities in blue states. The Washington Post is exclusively reporting that the Pentagon has been drawing up planning documents to deploy troops to Chicago to crack down on crime, homelessness, and undocumented immigration. Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker, as you know, wrote on social media, quote, "Donald Trump's threat to bring in the National Guard to Chicago isn't about safety. It's a test of the limits of his power and a trial run for a police state. Illinois has long worked with federal law enforcement to tackle crime, but we won't let a dictator impose his will." Earlier this year, Trump sent troops to Los Angeles against the wishes of the governor and the mayor. And the question of whether he was allowed to do that is still being litigated.
And I gather there was a surprise on Friday during an event about next year's soccer World Cup draw. President Trump held a photo that someone had sent him.
Yes, that's right. And that someone was Russian President Vladimir Putin. Take a listen to how it all unfolded.
He's been very respectful of me and of our country, but not so respectful of others. But I'm going to sign this for him, but I was sent one, and I thought you'd all like to see it. That's a man named Vladimir Putin.
Which is remarkable. There was the President of the United States in the Oval Office proudly holding up a picture of himself with a Russian dictator with a portrait of Ronald Reagan looming over his shoulder. This despite no signs of progress in Trump's quest to secure peace in Russia's war against Ukraine. Trump said on Friday that sanctions could be back on the table and that he'd know more in 2 weeks.
That's NPR senior White House correspondent Tamara Keith. Thank you for joining us.
You're welcome.
Ukraine is marking its Independence Day. The country's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, gave a speech today reminding fellow Ukrainians that we're fighting for freedom. But there's little to cheer. Joining us now to discuss the recent diplomatic push is Yaroslav Trofimov. He's the chief foreign affairs correspondent of the Wall Street Journal. He's also the author of No Country for Love, a novel set in 1930s Ukraine. Welcome to the program.
Great to be on the show.
So let's start with Russia. How will it view this moment?
Well, Russia wanted to extinguish Ukraine's independence. That was the primary goal of the invasion 3.5 years ago in February 2022. And look at it now. There are no Ukrainian tanks in Kyiv. There are foreign dignitaries, including the Canadian Prime Minister, visiting the Ukrainian capital today. And all of Russia's efforts to subordinate Ukraine have not been successful. Russia has lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers over the past nearly 3 years, since November 2022. And for all that effort, managed to advance by less than 1% of Ukrainian territory. So I think Ukrainians have a reason to celebrate today that their independence is safeguarded. Maybe not the entire land of Ukraine, but still 80% of Ukraine is free.
But the war is dragging on, and we heard from Russia's top diplomat on Friday that no meeting is planned between President Putin and his Ukrainian counterpart. What do you think the chances are that there will ever be a meeting between these two men?
Well, I think chances are pretty slim right now because President Putin of Russia thinks he can win this war, and he operates in a different time frame. He has this messianic vision of being the gatherer of Russian lands. And if you remember, this war began with him writing a historical essay on how the Ukrainians are really Russians and they do not deserve a separate future. So I think his mission in life, as he sees it, is to bring Ukraine back into the fold of Russia and extinguish Ukrainian statehood. And that is the reason why the Ukrainians are resisting so hard today. I wrote in my novel about the famine that killed millions of Ukrainians in the 1930s, and the sort of wholesale elimination of the Ukrainian elites by the Soviet regime at the time. It's a story that is a story of so many Ukrainian families. Well, the Ukrainians today all have grandmothers or grandfathers like me who went through the same experience, and they know that surrender to Russia is worse than whatever sacrifices they have to make today to keep fighting Russia.
But I guess
so surrender is not an option.
But when you look at how to actually bring this war to a close or what's going to happen next, President Trump is renewing a threat to impose sanctions on Russia if there's no progress in making a peace deal. But sanctions have been imposed before. What would it actually take for Putin to change course on Ukraine?
Well, there are two wars going on. There is a war on the battlefield, which is a stalemate, more or less. Russia is advancing less slowly. And then there is the air war. And Ukraine, for example, has been hitting harder and harder at the Russian oil and gas infrastructure, which is the lifeline for the Russian economy. And that oil and gas revenue is what allows Russia to keep recruiting soldiers for the war. President Trump also has already imposed sanctions on India for buying Russian oil. India buys about almost 40% of Russian oil exports. So strangling this source of revenue could actually change the cost-benefit analysis in Moscow and create constraints for the Russian war machine.
What do you think the U.S. is willing to do that sort of pressure?
Well, there is already a concrete step with India. Now, will President Trump go any further? He changes his mind on this war very regularly. And so far, these threats of making big decisions in 2 weeks have been repeated and then pulled back. It's clear that the meeting in Alaska was a big victory for President Putin because he succeeded in removing this threat of sanctions and removing also President Trump's demand for an immediate ceasefire.
Well, do you think it's feasible for Ukraine to keep fighting this war without meaningful American support?
Well, there is a European support. The Europeans now account for the majority of support for Ukraine. And the Europeans are also going to be buying American weapons that cannot be produced in Ukraine. Is it feasible? I mean, the question is, what is the alternative? If the alternative is a surrender, which is what President Putin is demanding, essentially, because the Russian demands, as voiced by Foreign Minister Lavrov in recent days, are very similar to what they were back when the war began, basically. A Ukraine that is unable to defend itself, a Ukraine that does not have any security guarantees, and a Ukraine that surrenders large parts of its territory. So this surrender is not acceptable to Ukrainians because they know from their bitter history in the past, the history that my book talks about, that there will be more death and more killing and more destruction if they accept to be under Russian rule again.
What do you see any breakthrough to end this war in the coming weeks? Do you think that's possible?
I think it's highly unlikely that there will be any breakthrough in the coming weeks because the Russians still think they can win it, and the President Putin thinks he can outlast the will of the West. And obviously, now that American support for Ukraine is much reduced compared to what it was under President Biden, he thinks he can gain the upper hand in the battlefield, and eventually the front line will crumble and Ukraine will collapse. And the Ukrainians, with the help of the Europeans, are doing everything they can to prevent this sort of catastrophic outcome.
That's Yaroslav Trofimov of the Wall Street Journal. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be there.